Hi, everybody. Just a quick announcement before we start class, especially to the people who are taking this with CUNY. Please do sign your name at the sign-up sheet at the front desk because we will need to share attendance records with CUNY. So please do sign your name. It's there throughout the class. Thanks.
Okay, so this week we're doing the transition from money to capital. In my diagram that I always go back to, we're still just only on this little bit down the bottom where money is forming its money capital and going up into here. So, but the interesting thing I think about the text is that there is a narrative structure. And sometimes I think it's useful to remember what the narrative structure is. And the narrative structure is an attempt to take us from the varieties of exchange, which eventually create different forms of money, and the forms of money create the possibility for a particular circulation process, which is a circulation and accumulation of capital. So the narrative structure is sort of moving step by step. And one of the things that I think is always amazing to me about trying to understand Marx's mode of thought is that suddenly when you come across one of these plans that he lays out for what he wants to do, it's like this enormous universe of possible books and things to write about the totality of what capital is about and what the totality of what a capitalist society is about. The enormity of that contrasts with usually the very fine-grained discussion of exactly what happens when you exchange this with that. And it's that kind of relationship between if you like, the universality, the enormity, the grandiosity of the thinking, and the particularity of the investigation. And it's that sort of relationship which is always seems to be in Marx's mind. But as you see from the commentaries, he sometimes will say, well, this doesn't belong here yet. So that he's got in mind what it is, should be where, and that is one of the features. So what we're doing here is moving sort of step by step from the money, which has been a general topic of discussion, again largely in conversation with Proudhon and the Proudhonistas, and that conversation is going to continue in this section, but nevertheless it's I think useful to recognize the movement that's going on in the text. And he starts off here on page 239 with what in fact is a dry run for what turns up in Capital as the fetish of commodities, in which he's basically saying that we really have to grasp money as a social relation, as a historical relation, but it has a representation as a thing. In fact, in terms of the money commodities, it's as gold and silver, but as he points out, gold and silver are not in themselves money. Nature does not produce money any more than it produces a rate of exchange or a banker. And in Peru and Mexico, gold and silver, of which there was plenty, of course, at that, and being plundered by the Spanish. There's plenty of gold and silver, but it did not serve as money. And therefore we have to think very much about the nature of the social relation and the system, the problems that arise when social relations become represented in terms of relations between things, which is the big argument that occurs in Capital when Marx talks about the fetish of commodities. But again, what he's doing here is kind of saying, if the appearance occurs as things, then and there's something wrong, then you tend to criticize the things rather than the social relations which the things represent. And this is the issue he takes up on 240. And he has this metaphor of the donkey and the sack. You try and hit the donkey and you hit the sack, the donkey doesn't notice. Only when you actually hit it hard enough so that the donkey feels it do you find out what's going on there. And he says that that we need to recognize this, because otherwise we get in this situation which he's already criticized about the Proudhon view, which is that somehow or other artful tinkering with money is then supposed to overcome the contradictions of which money is merely the perceptible appearance. Equally clear that some revolutionary operations can be performed with money insofar as an attack on it seems to leave everything else as it was, only to rectify it. As long as these operations are directed against money as such, they are merely an attack on consequences whose causes remain unaffected. Disturbance of the productive process, whose solid basis then also has the power, by means of more or less violent reaction, to define and to dominate these, are merely passing disturbances. Now, Marx was writing, of course, at a moment in 1857-58 where there was deep disturbances in the monetary system, and there was a lot of discussion of the problems of money without any attempt to go into the social relations that might have lain at the root of it. And then he even goes on to say this, that the inherent contradictions of bourgeois society appear extinguished in money relations as conceived in a simple form. And bourgeois democracy, even more than the bourgeois economist, takes refuge in this aspect in order to construct apologetics for the existing economic relations. So that, in a sense, bourgeois comprehensions of the market structure and monetary form and all the rest of it become a means of disguising. And in fact, the bourgeois society likes to disguise much of what goes on in terms of social relations. But then Marx takes off and starts to look at what actually goes on, and this is him saying, well, actually what goes on in the moment of exchange between two individuals, and this is where Marx is going into the very narrow, particular kind of discussion of what happens at that moment, because this moment is terribly important in terms of what happens in the totality. You have to understand the moment in order to understand the totality. And what he points out is that as subjects of exchange, the two people exchanging end up being in a relation of equality. So that the principle of equality becomes very, very significant because they're exchanging equivalents. And as he says at the bottom of 241, only three moments emerge as formally distinct: the subjects of the relation, the exchangers, the objects of their exchange values, equivalents which are not only equal but are expressly supposed to be equal and are posited as equal, and finally the act of exchange itself, the mediation by which the subjects are posited as exchangers equals and their objects as equivalents equal. So what out of this comes a notion of equivalence, and it's an equivalence in the midst of difference, because the only reason for the exchange is that you can exchange different things. There's no point exchanging the same thing, so you're going to exchange something different. So it's the equivalence which exists within the exchange which is significant, but the exchange involves difference. So this is actually kind of the way in which Marx is setting this up, and as he says on 242, natural differences are therefore the precondition of their social equality in the act of exchange. In this respect, natural difference puts them reciprocally into the relation of equality. So out of this comes this notion of the exchange actually creates it rests upon this equivalence and this equality and reciprocity. And this is taken even further on 243, where he starts to talk about it's not only a quality of equality that is involved here, but also freedom. So that the question of freedom enters in on 243. And then he kind of says, although individual A feels a need for the commodity of individual B, he does not appropriate it by force, nor vice versa, but rather they recognize one another reciprocally as proprietors, as persons, whose will penetrates their commodities. Accordingly, the juridical moment of the person enters here, as well as that of freedom. So we've got equality, freedom, juridical individualism, and all of this is, in a sense, inserted into a world where what is being experienced, as he says on the top of 243, is an experience of common species being. Now, species being was a very important category in the economic and philosophic manuscripts of 1844, where Marx was being a real idealist and a humanist, and really kind of thought it was important to explore species being as something which was individuals were alienated from by the market and all the rest of it. So in the economic and philosophic manuscripts, he had this kind of idealist conception of humanity. And that idealist conception was captured by this concept of species being. This is about the only mention in the Grundrisse of the concept of species being. But species being here is, in a sense, I think, used rather ironically, in the sense that this is the kind of species being that arises out of the acts of exchange. And that species being is about equality and freedom and individualism and the like. And the kind of social relation that exists in this is that, as he says on bottom 243, each serves the other in order to serve himself. Each makes use of the other reciprocally as his means. Now both things are contained in the consciousness of the two individuals, that each arrives at his end only insofar as he serves the other as means, that each becomes means for the other only as end in himself. And this is a kind of about the world of reciprocity. So the question of exchange is then here being explored and in terms of its qualities. And on 244, he kind of comes to the sort of a conclusion. With that, then, he says, complete freedom of the individual is posited. Voluntary transaction, no force on either side. Positing of the self as means, or as serving only as means, in order to posit the self as an end in itself, as dominant and primary. Finally, the self-seeking interest, which brings nothing of a higher order to realization. The other is also recognized and acknowledged as one who likewise realizes his self-seeking interest, so that both know that the common interest exists only in the duality, many-sidedness, and autonomous development of the exchanges between self-seeking interest. The general interest is precisely the generality of self-seeking interest. Therefore, when the economic form exchange posits the all-sided equality of its subjects, then the content, the individual, as well as the objective material which drives towards the exchange, is freedom. Equality and freedom are thus not only respected in exchange based on exchange values, but also the exchange of exchange values is the productive, real basis of all equality and freedom. Now, what Marx is doing here is, of course, taking liberal theory and saying liberal theory is, in fact, expressive of what you would derive from acts of exchange under the conditions outlined here. And this is, I think, therefore, a critique of liberal theory, because liberal theory sometimes acts as if all of, the noble savage, all that kind of thing arose out of, sort of, again, out of species being. But here Marx is kind of saying, well, the liberal theory is attached to this moment of exchange, and you can derive notions of equality and freedom out of a simple analysis of the act of exchange in itself. But the act of exchange, we know, at some point or other is going to be mediated by money. And so that money actually then becomes significant, and the rise of exchange value is going to become associated with this, and the relations of buyers and sellers are going to be distinctly set up. But this notion of natural freedom and equality is something which we will find in Capital. And I don't know if you remember what goes on, so that if I go to the end of chapter 6 of Capital, Marx starts talking about the market as the exclusive realm of freedom, equality, property, and Bentham. And this comes from Capital. Freedom, because both buyer and seller of a commodity, let us say of labour power, are determined only by their own free will. They contract as free persons or are equal before the law. Equality, because each enters into relation with the other as with the simple owner of commodities, and they exchange equivalent for equivalent. Property, because each disposes only of what is his own. And Bentham, because each looks only to his own advantage. The only force bringing them together and putting them into relation with each other is the selfishness, the gain, and the private interest of each. Each pays heed to himself only, and no one worries about the others. And precisely for this reason, either in accordance with the pre-established harmony of things or under the auspices of an omniscient providence, they all work together to their mutual advantage for the common weal and in the common interest. Now this is, of course, the hidden hand of the market, within which equality, freedom, and bourgeois constitutionality is embedded. And I think it's fascinating when you actually look at all of the bourgeois constitutions that exist around the world. Most of them are expressive of notions of equality and freedom and liberty and all the rest of it. And this is Marx in Capital turns this into a very ironic description of the standard form of liberal bourgeois constitutionality, and of how the hidden hand of the market supposedly works in its utopian form. But what is interesting, I think, is that Marx presents this finding in Capital as something that is a fact, whereas here what he's doing is he's discovering it through minutiae of the moments of exchange and what happens in moments of exchange. And all of this appears, he says on 247, as natural freedom and equality. Now, Marx often uses this term natural in a double sense. One is that it's due to nature in the kind of broad way in which we might think about nature. But the other is it's natural to capital. That is, capital creates its own nature. It creates its own human nature. And it creates its own, and so something appears natural, it appears as if it is inevitable and therefore unalterable given the form of the mode of production. And he then says, well, this distinction which exists doesn't really get disturbed even by what might seem to be disruptive elements. For example, on 247, he makes the point that just because you and I have exchanged, and if you decide to save and I decide to splurge, it can end up where you may end up with a more accumulated wealth than I do. And Marx kind of says, but that doesn't actually disturb the act of exchange and the equality and freedom that exists in the realm of exchange. It just says that the equality and freedom are being used by two individuals in rather different ways. So it doesn't disturb anything very much. But, he says, on bottom of 247, here we go, in present bourgeois society as a whole, This positing of prices and their circulation, etc., appears as a surface process, and beneath which, however, in the depths, entirely different processes go on, in which this apparent individual equality and liberty disappear. It is forgotten, on one side, with the presupposition of exchange value as the objective basis of the whole of the system of production, already in itself implies, he says, a certain compulsion over the individual. And the individual is in fact historical, already determined by society. This is on 248. And what this reveals, he says, is the foolishness of these socialists, namely the French, who want to depict socialism as realization of the ideals of bourgeois society, who demonstrate that exchange and exchange value are originally or essentially, in their adequate form, a system of universal freedom and equality. The Proudhon argument was universal exchange is based upon freedom and equality. The trouble is it's got perverted in some way by the monetary form. And it is the perversion of that that needs to be corrected. So the socialist program is to come up with a genuine history of these relations in place of the fake, and the proper reply to them is that exchange value, and this is Marx replying, that exchange value, or more precisely the money system, is in fact the system of equality and freedom, and that the disturbances which they encounter in the further development of the system are disturbances inherent in it. They are merely the realization of equality and freedom. In fact, the realization of equality and freedom in the market is going to be something other than what we expect. It is just as pious, he says, as it is stupid to wish that exchange value would not develop into capital, nor labour which produces exchange value into wage labour. What divides these gentlemen, that's the socialists, from the bourgeois apologists, is on the one side their sensitivity to the contradictions included in the system. On the other, the utopian inability to grasp the necessary difference between the real and the ideal form of bourgeois society. And this is the cause of their desire to undertake the superfluous business of realizing the ideal expression again, which is in fact only the inverted projection of this reality. And then he goes on to critique Bastiat and so on. Now what's involved here is this, that the system produces this possibility of equality, freedom, liberty, etc., etc. The system produces that possibility, but that possibility is the one which is going to be taken up by capital and going to be taken up by wage labour in such a way as to lead to something radically different. And this Proudhonian move is in fact about trying to take some notion of distribution or justice and liberty and freedom which is embedded in the bourgeois system and to perfect it. And the problem is the bourgeois system has not been perfected. And Marx kind of says, well, if you perfect this bourgeois system, actually what you're going to perfect is something which in its, when you get to the bottom of it, is creating incredible inequality, incredible. Now, this is a sort of argument which still goes on. I mean, the whole argument around in Wall Street in the sort of 1990s was over the sort of perfect market hypothesis, which said basically the problem is the market is not perfected, and it's not perfected enough. And this was the whole neoliberal argument, right? That the market is not being allowed to bring us to the point of perfection. And the market will bring us to that point of perfection. And what Marx is kind of saying, that's precisely what Proudhon wanted to happen. That the efficient market hypothesis, which basically said that the equilibrium will occur and justice and liberty and freedom will be realized, that was the right-wing rhetoric. And it's been the right-wing rhetoric all along. And when it crashed and made a mess and all this kind of stuff, then nobody knew exactly quite what to do. And, Greenspan came out and said, well, maybe the efficient market, hypothesis, maybe there's something wrong with it. But reading Ayn Rand didn't help me understand what might be wrong with it. But if you go back into that Ayn Rand stuff and all that, this is perfectly what is going on here. And Marx in Capital kind of says, well, even a concept of social justice, if it is not situated in terms of its role in relationship to the dynamics of capital accumulation, the pursuit of social justice will actually attempt to perfect a bourgeois society, but will do it in such a way as to actually confirm and reconfirm bourgeois social relations. So this is what Marx is doing here, but he does it in Capital, but does it in a rather different way. And here I think you see more explicitly, particularly through his arguments with Proudhon. I mean, if you substitute Proudhon and say, okay, we're going to look at a sort of utopian. If you look at the libertarian, you look at Rand Paul, or you look at Nozick or somebody like that, you'll find a sort of a bourgeois utopianism, which is about the market, which is going to give us this perfect society, which is the utopian inability to grasp the necessary difference between the real and the ideal form of bourgeois society. So Marx is interested in discovering the real as opposed to the ideal. And here he's kind of saying, well, an ideal is there, but notice something. He doesn't say that liberty, freedom, and individuality and so on are pure idealist fictions. No, they actually have a material base. And their material base is this act of market exchange. And if the act of market exchange could be confined in some way, then it would indeed allow these virtues of equality and liberty and freedom to be realized. The problem is that it cannot be confined because it's not about that. And it never has been about that. It's about something very, very different. So this then says, well, okay, what's the disruptive force which is going to kind of destroy this narrative? I mean, this narrative has gone to point sort of saying, well, okay, we've got to this point. What is the disruptive force? Well, it's listed on 250. Money as capital. What does this mean? Money which goes beyond its simple character as money. So there is money, and there is money as capital. And he says on 251, money as capital is distinct from money as money. The new aspect to be developed. Okay, this is him saying to himself, okay, this is where we need to take the story now into the question of money as capital. And we need to follow it up, and as he says on 251, the initial task is to follow it up to its totality as money market. Then the rest of the development is presupposed and has to be brought in occasionally. Now, the money market is not actually going to be analysed. It's something that is going to come much, much later, and of course it's the topic of volume 3 of Capital. But he's basically saying this is where the story is headed. It's headed into the money market, and the money market, as it's constructed under Capital, is very distinctive. And when money is in a money market form, it is behaving in a very, very different way from money as it existed in ancient Rome, or as where it existed in 17th century or even 18th century capitalism. So this is where we start to deviate, if you like, from the preceding story. But in order to get to this story, he has to go back to the concept of value. And on 251, he starts to draw value back in. And one of the criticisms, I think, that can be made the argument in the Grundrisse is that Marx has not, I think, consolidated very well the theory of value. And he often treats value as if it's indistinguishable from exchange value. In Capital, it's very clear. There's use value, exchange value, and value is something distinct from exchange value. Whereas here, frequently, it seems as if exchange value is value, and he's not. So there's some muddle going on here, which is not really straightened out. But he kind of says, on the bottom of 251, as in the theory, the concept of value precedes that of capital, but requires for its pure development a mode of production founded on capital. So the same thing takes place in practice. And then he talks about the economists and so on. The existence, he says, of value in its purity and generality presupposes a mode of production in which the individual product has ceased to exist for the producer in general, and even more for the individual worker, where nothing exists unless it is realized through circulation. The determination of value, then, presupposes a given historic stage as the mode of social production, and is itself something given with that mode, hence a historic relation. Now, this is a frequent tactic in Marx, that he talks about co-evolution. That, and as he says in the next phrase, at the same time, individual moments of value determination develop in earlier stages of the historic process of social production and appear as its result. That is, value starts to crystallize out, but it can't crystallize out without the perfection of the mode of production. The mode of production can't be perfected without the value. So they co-determine each other, and therefore there's a co-evolutionary process which is historic. And that's the argument he's making here, that value comes into being. It is not universal, it comes into being as the mode of production consolidates itself, but it's also the main means by which the mode of production is consolidated. So you can make that argument of a co-evolutionary movement in which value and the mode of production co-evolve, so that we don't really understand what value does until the mode of production is perfected, and we don't understand how the mode of production works without the value theory operative. Hence the system of bourgeois society, capital follows immediately after money. In history, other systems came before, and then he goes on to other systems, and he starts to talk about landed capital, which begins where agriculture starts to be capitalized, and therefore market systems and so on. So that the value theory is beginning to be developed, but only in a lopsided way in relationship to the evolution of landed property. And he says of landed property at the bottom of 252, the history of landed property, which would demonstrate the gradual transformation of the feudal landlord into the landowner, of the hereditary, semi-tributary, and often unfree tenant for life into the modern farmer, and of the resident serfs, bondsmen, and villeins who belong to the property into agricultural day labourers. This indeed, he said, would be the history of the formation of modern capital. Again, Marx is kind of saying that landed capital as it existed, or landed ownership as it existed in the feudal period, has to be transformed. And this is the kind of transformation that brings landed capital into the history of the formation of bourgeois society. The same thing comes when he says, well, capital comes initially from circulation. And moreover, its point of departure is money. And therefore, the movement of buying in order to sell, which makes up the formal aspect of commerce of capital as merchant capital, is found in the earliest conditions of economic development. In exactly the same way that landed property has to be transformed to become the bourgeois form, so merchant capital has to be transformed so that it becomes a vehicle for the capitalist to work. And commercial capital, he says, is only circulating capital, and circulating capital is the first form of capital, in which it has yet by no means become the foundation of production. And a more developed form is money capital and money interest, usury. You remember in that design I have all of those distributives, there's merchant capital, there's landed capital, there's the banks and the financiers. These are all forms of distribution in the final version of the totality that are embedded within the capitalist dynamic. But Marx is kind of saying, once upon a time, they were separate. Finance capital worked on its own. It had usury and it had all kinds of crazy things that were going on in terms of debts and credits and all the rest of it. Merchant capital was also operative. Landed capital was also operative. So these different forms of capital existed and started to be transformed in accord with the value theory, but they are actually not yet, as it were, totally embedded within the totality of what a bourgeois society is all about. And then the question arises, well, so what is the bourgeois society all about? And this is taken up on 254, where he says, circulation, therefore, does not carry within itself the principle of self-renewal. Circulation can actually, is not, he says, circulation, therefore, which appears as that which is immediately present on the surface of bourgeois society, exists only so far as it is constantly mediated. Now, what's it mediated by? And what we get is this idea that the circulation of capital can be going on. This can be going on, but it's sort of it's in a sort of going on in a lopsided way. With some things going on in landed capital, some things going on in finance, some things going on in merchant activity. But what this entails is that this system is pushing towards something else in which there is something that mediates. And the first thing that mediation has to do is to turn this system into something which is self-expanding and self-creating. As he says, that this system comes around on 255, we have therefore reached the point of departure again. That is, you've come back to the point where money is now going to come back as money capital. We have therefore reached the departure. Production which posits, creates exchange values. But this time, production which presupposes circulation as a developed moment and which appears as a constant process, which posits circulation and constantly returns from it into itself in order to posit it anew. So in other words, what we're beginning to look at here is this process beginning to crystallize out. And that is, as it were, defining the heart of what a bourgeois society is about. And the surface appearance of circulation has within it something which is a vital principle, and that principle has already been set out on the bottom of 254. Circulation, therefore, does not carry within itself the principle of self-renewal. The moments of the latter are presupposed to it, not posited by it. Commodities constantly have to be thrown into it anew from outside, like fuel into a fire. Merchant capital, for example, when you think about it, what does a merchant capitalist do? Merchant capitalists buy cheap and sell dear. But once they sell dear, that's it. They've got the money back. They may or they may not continue. There is no necessity of merchant capital, once they have bought once and sold dear, to somehow or other continue the process. So when Marx kind of says, well, if merchant capital is active in society, it has to continually go and find new commodities which it could buy cheap and then sell dear. And Marx says that this is like they're constantly throwing new commodities into the fires of capital accumulation. And they have to keep on doing that. If they stop doing it, then the capital accumulation finishes. There is no principle of self-renewal in merchant capital. There is no principle of self-renewal even in usury or finance. There is no principle of self-renewal in the way in which landed capital works. So where and how is this principle of self-renewal initiated? And the answer is going to be given on 257, that capital, he says, is at a certain point going to be understood as accumulated, realized labor, properly objectified labor, which serves as the means for new labor production. And this is, he says, the formal character. And that formal character is taken over, and the bottom of 258, I think, is a crucial passage. The catch is that if all capital is objectified labor, which serves as means for new production, it is not the case that all objectified labor, which serves as means for new production, is capital. And the problem here is that capital is conceived as a thing, not as a relation. That is, capital, if it is conceived as a thing, can also be like merchant capital. You just throw more of it into circulation and that's it. It is said, on the other hand, and this is the crucial passage of 258, it is said, on the other hand, that capital is a sum of values used for the production of values. Then this means capital is self-reproducing exchange value. That is, capital is only capital when it becomes self-reproducing. But formally, exchange value reproduces itself even in simple circulation. The explanation, it is true, does contain the form wherein exchange value is the point of departure. But the connection with the content, which with capital is not, as in the case of simple exchange value, is dropped. It is said that capital is exchange value, which produces profit, or at least has the intention of producing a profit. Then capital is already presupposed in its explanation, for profit is a specific relation of capital to itself. Capital is not a simple relation, but a process. This is key. Capital is not a thing. It's not even a social relation, though it is a social relation, but it is a process in whose various moments it is always capital. This process, therefore, to be developed. Okay, this is kind of when Marx is saying, okay, this is what we've really got to get into here. I've got to spend a lot of time talking about this, so get ready. Already, he says, in accumulated labor, something has sneaked in, because in its essential characteristic, it should be merely objectified labor, in which, however, a certain amount of labor is accumulated. But accumulated labor already comprises a quantity of objects in which labor is realized. So this then says, all right, well, we've got to look now at this process. And this process is, of course, the whole kind of circulation that describes the totality. So this leads him on 259 to start on this process of what has to be investigated. To develop the concept of capital, it is necessary to begin not with labor, but with value, and precisely with exchange value in an already developed movement of circulation. This is where this problem of value and exchange value get merged, which later on they will not be. As soon as money is posited as an exchange value, which not only becomes independent of circulation, but which also maintains itself through it, then it is no longer money. For this, as such, does not go beyond the negative aspect, but is capital. Again, this kind of argument now we see much more clearly that money is not capital. Capital is money at a certain moment of its process. But that is different from saying that money is capital. So this relationship between money and capital becomes problematic. that money is the first form in which exchange value proceeds to the character of capital, and that hence the first form in which capital appears is confused with capital itself, or is regarded as sole adequate form of capital. This is a historic fact, which far from contradicting our development, rather confirms it. The first quality of capital that is then this, that exchange value, deriving from circulation and presupposing circulation, preserves itself within it and by means of it, does not lose itself by entering into it. That circulation is not the movement of its disappearance, but rather the movement of its real self-positing as exchange value, its self-realization as exchange value. Now, all other forms of exchange are extinguished in the act of exchange. If I barter with you and you give me some bananas and I eat the bananas disappear. They've gone out of the system. The commodities go out of the system. Consumption goes out of the system. A lot of petty commodity production actually simply is about creation of commodities, mediation through the market, and then disappearing out of the system. There is no necessity of any kind of self-expansion or self-creation, self-realization within that. But Marx is kind of saying what is true about capital is that circulation does not disappear. The money does not disappear, it remains within the system. Much of the production of means of production stays within the system. The value which is created stays within the system, which is going to be the argument in Capital, and it's not being clearly made here. But this system is self-replicating. It's quite simply, the process is, as he says at the top of 260, is really value in motion. He doesn't call it that, but you can see that in that way in which it is, value is presupposing circulation and preserves itself within it and by means of it, does not lose by entering it. I mean, in other words, value is being reproduced. And this creates a difference, which in Capital is largely represented by the distinction between hoarding and capital, and the distinction between the capitalist and the miser. The miser is somebody who does not actually launch money into circulation in order to protect the money. The miser is somebody who tries to protect the money by sticking the money under the mattress. Whereas Marx is kind of saying the capitalist does not do that. The capitalist protects the money by launching it back into circulation in order to reproduce value and produce surplus value. So this is money used in two radically different ways. The miser and the capitalist. And that is, a great distinction that Marx again puts up, but Marx takes this up here. He says, the immortality which money strove to achieve by setting itself negatively against circulation, that is hoarding it, putting it under the mattress, by withdrawing from it, is achieved by capital which preserves itself precisely by abandoning itself to circulation. That is, the capitalist is constantly putting the money back into circulation, which is what makes that money capital and which makes the hoarded money not capital. Capital, he says, becomes commodity and money alternately. But one, it is itself the alternation of both these roles. It becomes commodity, but not this or the other commodity, rather a totality of commodities. So, as he says on 262, money, the only aspect in which capital is here posited as distinct from direct exchange value and from money is that of exchange value which preserves and perpetuates itself in and through circulation. Again, he uses exchange value here when he should have said value, which preserves itself and perpetuates itself in and through circulation. So he then lays out three ways in which money can be used. One is simple negative, commodities thrown into circulation, they exchange for one another and it becomes an object of need and so on. With that, circulation comes to an end. Then this money is negated, and then finally exchange value is going to become involved in being put back into circulation. But if it's put back into circulation, it is only because it can engage in the multiplication of itself. So this crops up on 263. And with it, it is no longer a simple positing of equivalence, a preservation of its identity as in circulation, but rather multiplication of itself. So it's got to multiply. Exchange value posits itself as exchange value only by realizing itself, increasing its value. Money, as capital, has lost its rigidity and from a tangible thing has become a process. But at the same time, labour has changed its relation to its objectivity. It too has returned to itself. But the nature of the return is this, that the labour objectified in the exchange value posits living labour as the means of reproducing it, whereas originally exchange value appeared merely as a product of value. And this takes us to 264. And this is one of those wonderful moments where the grand vision is suddenly introduced in the plan, which is laid out in 264. General concept of capital, particularity of capital, capital as the necessaries of life, capital as money, quantity of capital, accumulation, circulation of capitals, competition of capitals, concentration of capitals, capital as credit, capital as share capital, capital as money market, capital as source of wealth, the capitalist after capital, landed property will be dealt with after that, wage labour. You go on. Okay, would you like to write a book about that? It's a good dissertation topic. Yeah, I'm sure you could do it in a PhD in 3 chapters. So then we get into product and value and back to the critique of Proudhon, which sort of seems to me to be a bit of a diversion in a way. But then this then gets us into this kind of question of how does it multiply and what are the consequences of its multiplication. And on 266, he says this. Okay, we look at commodity production and circulation. And the wholeness of circulation, regard in itself, lies in the fact that the same exchange value as subject, posits itself once as commodity, another time as money. Now, again, the exchange value should be value here. And that it is just this movement of positing itself in this dual character and preserving itself in each of them as its opposite, in the commodity as money and in money as commodity. This is in itself is present in simple circulation, but is not posited in it. Exchange value posited as the unity of commodity and money is capital. And this positing itself appears as the circulation of capital, which is, however, this is a very important point, a spiral, an expanding curve, not a simple circle. Now this point about you go from cyclical analysis to an analysis of the spiral form, very significant shift in perspective. Whereas up until now we've been talking about the cyclical activity, he's now introduced the fact that if there's a multiplication going on, it's no longer a cyclical process. It's a spiral. And what is this spiral about? The first presupposition for this to happen, he says, is that capital stands on one side and labour on the other. So what is the disruptive force that he's mentioned earlier to this whole kind of process? So what is it the bourgeois relations are concealing? It's the relation between capital and labour. That's what all bourgeois constitutionality actually disguises. It's very interesting. You go through the American Constitution, you go through any major constitution in the bourgeois world and see if there's anything about the capital-labor relation. It's never mentioned. The one constitution that tried to do it was the Portuguese Constitution of 1975, when the socialists came in, the socialist communists took power, and they tried to write a constitution which guaranteed the rights of labor against capital. Well, guess how well capital did in Portugal until they overthrew that constitution. And it's so interesting, And here Marx is kind of saying, okay, the first presupposition is that capital stands on one side and labour on the other. But he says something very interesting, extremely interesting here. The labour which stands opposite capital is alien labour, and the capital which stands opposite labour is alien capital. So there is a mutual alienation involved. Both lose something important. Exactly what is it? Why alien capital? Why can't it just be capital? It's alien capital and alien labor. Alien labor you can understand because you know that the capitalist is going to take away. But it doesn't start as alienated. It becomes alienated in the production process. But it's what Marx is saying here is alienated at the very beginning. It has to actually, by taking the commodity form, labor power has to become a commodity, and the laborer has to be the bearer of this commodity called labor power, which has nothing to do with the individuality of the laborer. I mean, what the laborer feels or thinks doesn't matter, because all the capitalist is interested in is labor power. So the laborer has to go into the market offering labor power as a commodity. And that in itself is an alienation of who the laborer is and what the laborer is about. And that actually crops up in this chapter rather neatly, rather nicely. But the same thing applies to the capitalist. Because the capitalist has to go into the capitalist process not as a free individual doing whatever the hell they like. No, they have to go in and actually do whatever has to be done to get the surplus value. In other words, once they are enmeshed in this system, both the capitalist and the laborer are alienated beings from the very get-go, not as a result of the system. They have to actually station themselves and offer themselves into this system as, in a sense, alienated individuals. And again, what this does is at a certain point you're going to feel sorry for the capitalist. Because the capitalist has to do things whether they like it or not. And some of this crops up in Capital, where Marx talks about the Faustian dilemma every capitalist feels about wanting to enjoy themselves and use all of the wealth they want in any way they want. But no, they have to actually reinvest. So you actually feel, a little sorry for the capitalist in Capital, because they're alienated too. But I think this is a very useful formulation. And he says the extremes which stand opposite one another are specifically different. In the first, positing of simple exchange, labour was structured in such a way that the product was not a direct use value for the labourer, not a direct means of subsistence. This was the general condition for the creation of exchange value and of exchange value in general. Otherwise, the worker would have produced only a product, a direct use value for himself, but not an exchange value. And then Marx continues, as soon as it has obtained motion from capital, this use value of the worker possesses, which is the capacity of creating value, exists as the worker's specific productive activity. It is his vitality itself directed towards a specific purpose, and hence expressing itself in a specific form. In the relation of capital and labour, exchange value and use value are brought into relation. The one side, capital, initially stands opposite the other side as exchange value, and the other labour stands opposite capital, and we get into a lot of discussion of this opposition between alien labour and alien capital in what follows. So when we get to 269 and 270, Marx begins to hint that this relationship of value and exchange value is maybe not quite adequate to what he wants to do. So, top of 270, the only utility whatsoever which an object can have for capital can be to preserve or increase capital. So capital needs use values, and the use value of the labourer is that the labourer can produce surplus value. And that's the only reason why the capitalist is interested in the labourer. The capitalist has no other interest in the labourer whatsoever and doesn't care what the labourer does. As long as the labourer produces surplus value, that's all that matters. Already for that reason, value which insists on itself as value preserves itself through increase. And it preserves itself precisely only by constantly driving beyond its quantitative barrier. Now, there's an interesting language here because Marx starts to introduce the idea of barriers into this process. And this whole system that I've been talking about, the totality, is full of barriers. And Marx is going to start to talk about those barriers and the need for capital to circumvent or transcend all of these barriers. So this insistence on value preserves itself through increase, and it preserves itself precisely only by constantly driving beyond its quantitative barrier. This contradicts its character as form, its inner generality. Thus, growing wealthy is an end in itself. The goal-determining activity of capital can only be that of growing wealthier, of magnification, of increasing itself. Has to grow. It thus does not by any means have the capacity, which according to its general concept it ought to have, namely the capacity of buying all pleasures, all commodities, the totality of the material substances of wealth. It is not able to take up everything. Fixed as wealth, as the general form of wealth, as value which counts as value, it is therefore the constant drive to go beyond its quantitative limit, an endless process. So here we're getting, Marx getting to the point of saying, well, it's endless capital accumulation, which is going to be the hallmark of what a capitalist society is about. Its own animation, he says, consists exclusively in that. It preserves itself as a self-validated exchange value distinct from a use value only by constantly multiplying itself. And he then says it's damn difficult for Messrs. The economists to make the theoretical transition from the self-preservation of value in capital to its multiplication. Again, economic theory may be all about growth in a certain kind of way, and a lot of it is about growth. But what Marx is saying here is that the economists have a hard time understanding the principle of endless accumulation which is embedded and embodied within what capital is about. And he talks about the character of capital and what constitutes its character. And this character, therefore, is something which he is seeking to characterize. Capital, as he says, by definition money, but not merely money in the simple form of gold and silver. The communal substance of all commodities, i.e. their substance, not as material stuff as physical character, but their communal substance as commodities and hence exchange values, is this, that they are objectified labour. The only thing distinct from objectified labour is non-objectified labour, labour which is still objectifying itself, labour as subjectivity. It is to be present in time, alive then, that it can present only as the living subject, in which it exists as capacity, as possibility, hence as worker. So Marx is now here defining work and what it means to be a worker. And the worker is a value-creating, productive labor. And in the next page or two, he's going to very briefly summarize some comments on the distinction between productive and unproductive labor. And he then says about this, that labor as mere performance of services for the satisfaction of immediate needs has nothing whatever to do with capital, since it is not capital's concern. It is unproductive labor. Productive labor is that labor which produces surplus value for capital. All other forms of labor are effectively unproductive. And in this, he's taking up productive and unproductive labor was a very important category, and he cites this on the next page. Adam Smith was very much into this. And if you really want to get into how Marx thinks of Adam Smith and productive and unproductive labor, you go to Theories of Surplus Value, which is a whole volume. Part one of that is almost entirely about Adam Smith and theories of productive and unproductive labor. So Marx thinks that's obviously terribly important, but he doesn't deal much further with it here, except to say that labor as mere performance of services for the satisfaction has nothing to do with the endless accumulation and the multiplication of capital and the production of surplus value. Now, there are caveats to that, and there are different ways in which we can think about productive and unproductive labor. And actually, in Capital, Marx gives it very short shrift. He sort of mentions it, but doesn't really go very far with it. In fact, I think he was moving away from thinking of total agreement with Adam Smith about the nature of productive and unproductive labor. And then the same relation, he says, holds for all services which workers exchange directly for the money of other persons and which are consumed by these persons. Labor power exchanged against revenues is not part of the capitalist dynamic. If I hire somebody to, clean my roof or something, or the leaves out of my gutters or something like that, this is not a capitalist transaction. This is me just using my revenues, and I hire somebody to do it. So it's wage labor, could be, but it's not part of capital accumulation. In capital, Marx will say it can become part of capital accumulation if there's a capitalist who decides to hire a lot of people to go around cleaning people's gutters, and that therefore pays wage labor a certain amount and then charges a certain amount, and therefore the laborers themselves are producing surplus value for the capitalist. So Marx then kind of says, well, what looks like a service in fact is turned into a productive activity by that transformation of that social relation. But here he's not really going into this in any detail. But and then he goes on. But the back of 273, he says, but return in more detail to the productive and unproductive. That is, he is planning to go back to the question of productive and unproductive labor in much greater detail, which he does, as I've said, in Theories of Surplus Value. He introduces, however, out of this, on 274, what for me is, I think, a rather important distinction, which is between capital and not capital. 274 is a problematic passage. The use value, which confronts capital as positive exchange value, is labor. So, and of course, the use value of labor is its capacity to produce surplus value. Capital exchanges itself, or exists in this role, only in connection with not capital, the negation of capital, without which it is not capital. The real not capital is labor. Interesting idea. Okay. Therefore, the laborer is not capital and is never capital. The labourer is used to make capital, and the labourer is crucial to the reproduction of capital and the reproduction of the capitalist, but the labourer is not capital. Which means that the labourer is, by definition, if you like, always the site of not capital, i.e., that is the site of anti-capitalist struggle. The real not capital is labour, which is Marx kind of saying there's bound to be class struggle. There has to be class struggle. And he's not mentioned it right up until now. If we consider the exchange between capital and labour, then we find that it splits into two processes which are not only formally but also qualitatively different and even contradictory. The worker sells his commodity, labour, actually he should say labour power, not labour, which has a use value, and as commodity also a price, like all other commodities, for a specific sum of exchange values, specific sum of money, which capital concedes to him. Part 2, the capitalist obtains labour itself, labour as value-positing activity, as productive labour, that is, capacity to produce surplus value. He obtains a productive force which maintains and multiplies capital, and which thereby becomes the productive force, the reproductive force of capital, a force belonging to capital itself. It belongs to capital because the capitalist has purchased the labour power. Since the capitalist purchases the labour power is the property of capital. The labourer is not the property of capital, but the labour power is the property of capital. And capital will use that labour power to produce surplus value and reproduce itself. But the labourer is always not capital. Always something different. There's a distinction, he says, between the exchange of capital and labour. And these two different processes, from the standpoint of capital and the standpoint of labourer, are within the process of circulation, but at the same time they're contradictory. So on 275 we get another plan, which is about particularity, accumulation of capitals, competition of capitals, concentration of capitals, quantitative distinction, singularity, capitalist credit, capitalist stock capital, capitalist money market. Here we go, all of this, and this is ground rent, and this has to deal with this, and then we gets into some more thinking about landed property and the role of landed property in proletarianization, which is kind of an important part of the story of capital, the creation of modern agriculture through primitive accumulation, so some of that is then discussed, and we get out of this on 278 a point where I had noted before in the first lecture when we talked about totality, where Marx says on 278, while in the completed bourgeois system every economic relation presupposes every other in its bourgeois economic form, and everything posited is thus also a presupposition, and this is the case with every organic system, this organic system itself as a totality has its presuppositions, and its development to its totality consists precisely in subordinating all elements of society to itself, or in creating out of it the organs which it still lacks. This is historically how it becomes a totality. The process of becoming this totality forms a moment of its process, of its development. On the other hand, if within one society the modern relations of production, i.e. capital, are developed to its totality, and this society then seizes hold of a new territory, as e.g. the colonies, then it finds, or rather its representative, the capitalist finds, That is, capital ceases to be capital without wage labour, and that one of the presuppositions of the latter is not only landed property in general, but modern landed property which, as capitalised rent, is expensive, which as such excludes the direct use of the soil by individuals. And then he talks about landed property and the form of the market, which then leads him to start to think about the forms of markets. The fantastic list of different markets on page 281, where he says the grain market, the colonial produce market, the coffee, tea, the fruits market, the provisions market, the raw materials market, the flax, hemp, cotton, silk, wool, hides, leather, etc. So again, it's so interesting how Marx moves from kind of these grandiose things to kind of saying, actually, I need to know about the linen market or now, on 282, 83, well, onwards, there's, I think, a very interesting discussion of labour. And it's, he talks a little bit about the labour of the capitalist, but doesn't put much store in that as being that significant, and starts to talk a little bit about the distinctions of skills which are available within the labour force. But then on 283, the middle, he starts to say this: like every individual subject within circulation, the worker is the owner of a use value. He exchanges this for money, for the general form of wealth, but only in order to exchange this again for commodities considered as the objects of his immediate consumption, as a means of satisfying his needs. But then what follows is a depiction of the kinds of needs that the worker might have. The spheres of his consumption, he says, is not qualitatively restricted, only quantitatively. That is, once the worker gets the money, you can't stop the worker from going into the market and buying whatever they want. They're free as consumers. They become consumers, and the only problem is they don't have enough exchange value to go out and buy up everything they want. The sphere of his consumption is not qualitatively restrictive, and this distinguishes him from the slave. Consumption certainly reacts on production itself, but this reaction concerns the worker in his exchange as little as it does any other seller of a commodity. This much, however, can even now be mentioned in passing, namely that the relative restriction on the sphere of workers' consumption gives them as consumers an entirely different importance as agents of production from that which they possessed, e.g. in antiquity or in the Middle Ages. But as noted, this does not belong here yet. Similarly, because the worker receives the equivalent in the form of money, the form of general wealth, he is in this exchange an equal vis-a-vis the capitalist, like every other party in exchange. At least, so he seems. And then he talks about what is essential is that the purpose of the exchange for him is the satisfaction of his need. And what he obtains from the exchange is therefore not exchange value, not wealth, but a means of subsistence, objects for the preservation of his life, the satisfaction of his needs in general, physical, social, etc. What he gives up is his power to dispose of his labour power. On the other side, he can transform it into money by stockpiling it, and then talks about the way in which the worker can actually save exchange value and sacrifice substantial satisfaction to obtain the form of wealth through self-denial, saving, cutting corners in his consumption, so as to withdraw less from circulation than he puts goods into it. This is the only possible form of enriching oneself which is posited by circulation itself, self-denial. And then he then talks about the way in which the bourgeoisie is actually going to try very much to inculcate in the worker a culture of self-denial. Because if the worker can self-deny, then you can lower wages. And so, hence still today on 285, the demand for industriousness and also for saving self-denial is made not upon the capitalists but on the workers, and namely by the capitalists. Society today makes the paradoxical demand that he for whom the object of exchange is subsistence should deny himself, not he for whom it is wealth. The illusion that the capitalists in fact practiced self-denial and became capitalists thereby, a demand and a notion which only made any sense at all in the early period when capital was emerging from feudal relations, has been abandoned by all modern economists of sound judgment. The workers are supposed to save, and much bustle is made with savings banks, etc. As regards the latter, even the economists admit their proper purpose is not wealth, but merely a more purposeful distribution of expenditure. And then he talks about poorhouses and costs of social reproduction. Still, says Marx, no economist will deny if the workers generally, that is as workers, what the individual worker does or can do as distinct from his genus can only exist just as exception, not as rule. That is, they acted according to this demand as a rule. And hence also to production, but also to the amount and volume of exchanges which they could make with capital, hence to themselves as workers. Then the worker would be employing means which absolutely contradict their purpose, and which would directly degrade him to the level of the Irish. Marx is not very kind to the Irish in his early writings. In his later writings, he did start to become much more concerned about the condition of the Irish, but this would be a familiar trope, and of course it's the sort of thing, and actually the writings, there's an interesting parallel. If you read a lot of Marx and Engels' writings about how to think about the Irish, I think there's a very good parallel between how you would think of Puerto Ricans. I mean, in exactly the same way that the Puerto Ricans are part of the United States, and that therefore there's free movement. The Irish had free movement into Britain, and they were treated very much in the same sort of way, and the same things were being said about them in terms of their cultural habits and all the rest of it, and a certain kind of cultivation of an air of inferiority and willingness to live at the lower living standards than the rest of the working class were concerned with. So this was a sort of but this abstemiousness contrasts, and I think this is some rather lovely kind of passages in 286 to 287, which I draw your attention to. Because throughout much of Marx's writings, you don't actually get the kind of notion of the worker as a human being with what real wants, needs and desires and concerns and all the rest of it. The worker is kind of, quote, a role. And in terms of the role, it's very clearly depicted in Capital as notions of exploitation and so on. But here Marx is taking a much more, the workers' demand, he says, to a minimum of life's pleasures, and they want to save in order to make crises easier to bear, maintain themselves as pure labouring machines for capital, of course, and pay their own wear and tear. And then he goes on to say, talk about quite apart from the sheer brutalization to which this leads, and such a brutalization itself would make it impossible even to strive for wealth in general form, and the worker's participation in the higher, even cultural satisfactions, the agitation of his own interests, newspaper subscriptions, attending lectures, educating his children, developing his taste, etc. His only share of civilization, which distinguishes him from the slave, is economically only possible by widening the sphere of his pleasures at the times when business is good, where saving is to a certain degree possible. Apart from this, if he saved him money in a proper ascetic manner and thus heaped up premiums for the lumpen proletariat, pickpockets, etc., who would increase in proportion with the demand, he could conserve phasing. And he talks about piggy bank accounts, the conserving of savings, and after having in times of prosperity foregone all life's pleasures in order to increase the power of capital, Thus he is saved in every way for capital, not for himself. Incidentally, and I think this is kind of interesting, insofar as the whole thing is not hypocritical phrase of bourgeois philanthropy, which consists in fobbing the worker off with pious wishes, each capitalist does demand that his workers should save, but only his own, because they stand towards him as workers, but by no means the remaining world of workers, for these stand towards him as consumers. So individual capitalists will want other workers to be well paid so they can buy their product, but they themselves will not raise wages to buy their own product. So this is the kind of the hypocrisy. In spite of all the pious speeches, he therefore searches for means to spur them on to consumption, to give his wares new charms, to inspire them with the new needs of constant chatter, etc. God, this is just like watching contemporary television. It is precisely this side of the relation of capital and labour which is an essential civilizing moment, and on which the historic justification but also the contemporary power of capital rests. This relation between production and consumption to be developed only under capital and profit, etc. The demands of hypocritical bourgeois philanthropy turn out to be self-contradictory, and thus to prove precisely what they were supposed to refute, namely that in the exchanges between the worker and capital, the worker finds himself in the relation of simple circulation, hence obtains not wealth but only subsistence, use values for immediate consumption. So this discussion here about how the labourer as person with wants, needs, desires relates to the conditions of life, and there's some sort of evocation here of what the workers might try to acquire in the process of class struggle. And the question of the value of labour power then also enters in here. The free wage worker, he says, has and himself has no value. It is rather his power of disposing of his labour which has value. It is not he who stands towards the capitalist as exchange value, but the capitalist towards him. His valuelessness, in other words, the labourer himself, herself, is seen as valueless. They have no value, and their devaluation is the presupposition of capital, and the precondition of free labour in general. So, in what ways can the humanity of the labourer be expressed under these conditions of consumption and production? And to what degree is it possible to find some pleasures in that life? When in fact what is supposed to be all about is self-betterment. I mean, one of course, the foibles of neoliberalism was to say that we should all be entrepreneurs in ourselves and develop ourselves. But do we develop ourselves, or do we develop ourselves so we can be better fodder for capital accumulation? I think the fake claims of neoliberalism that by being entrepreneurs in ourselves we can improve our lot is, for the majority of people, that does not apply, that they're trying to become entrepreneurs in themselves. What they do is they become more and more involved in becoming the kind of labourers which can be more easily exploited by capital. This is, if you like, but again, some of these arguments that Marx is making here have a contemporary kind of resonance. But anyway, you can take on those few pages and reflect on them for yourself. It's not, but it's this kind of question of the fact that the labourer is alienated before they get even into the system. They're not alienated within the system, their alienation is presupposed by the fact that they are bearers of labor power and they're in a commodity market where they have to sell that labor power. But as human beings, they're something different. And I think this distinction between the worker as a human being and the worker as a bearer of labor power, and all that capital is concerned with is concerned with them as the bearer of labor power, and of course is concerned also with the qualities of that labor power, is also the value of that labor power, and to the degree that workers become industrious in their own right, they actually create a situation where capitalists can say, thank you very much, we can now reduce the value of labor power because you've learned to live with austerity, you've learned to live an abstemious kind of life. And of course a lot of social welfare structure is about teaching people to live in an abstemious way. I mean, the whole foundation of for instance, the formation of the Russell Sage Foundation was about a sociological concern with the lives of working people. And when Henry Ford set up his system of a $5 8-hour day, there was very great concern about workers would misuse the resources they had at their command. And so Russell Sage Foundation trained all of these social psychologists to go into the workers' homes and try to teach them how to consume properly so that they didn't abuse the possibilities of that $5 8-hour day, so that this had to be what Marx calls the kind of proper consumption in relationship to accumulation. That rational consumption and rational consumerism is something which fits with the productive capacities of a capitalist system. So this whole kind of question of what the worker does with their wage is just roughly taken up here and something to be dealt with or elsewhere. So why don't I stop just here and see if there are some issues you want to raise. I mean, there's a few pages which I suggested you also look at, which is up to page 304, but I think that I've been yabbering on quite a lot. What kind of questions do you have coming out of this?
Thank you. Again, thank you, David, for this lecture. I want to point out specifically to page 275, and it's just, I guess, a clarification or expansion of his argument that perhaps you can elucidate on. Right at the bottom of it, when he says in the money market, I'm not sure if you are there.
275?
275, yes. Mm-hmm. It says in the money market. Right, this is in the money market, capital is posited in its totality. There it determines prices, gives works, regulates production. In a word, is the source of production. But capital not only as something which produces itself, positing prices, material in the industry, developing force of production, but at the same time as creator of values. Creator of values, that's the part where, it says, has to posit value or form of wealth specifically distinct from capital. And then he says, this is ground rent. And then he goes on by saying, this is the only value created by capital which is distinct from itself, right? And then from its own production. By its nature as well, historical capital is the creator of modern life property, of ground rent, and so forth, right? Now, I wonder if you could elaborate a little bit more on that space when it says, like, this is the only value created by capital which is distinct from itself, from its own production, as it's in several terms is, sometimes it's conceived as part of it, of the production of capital, right? So what is he trying to work around there, according to what you read?
He's dealing, I think, with the the whole kind of question of how landed property, which is in a sense the basis of the feudal system, and is being transformed into into its capitalistic form. There is an argument that could be made that in a pure capitalist society, there is no place for ground rent, and there is no place for landed property. For instance, that would be the Henry George kind of argument, and you should get landed property. You should get rid of it entirely. Marx never does that. He's always kind of coming back, as he does right at the end of Capital, to kind of saying, there's a big class of people here called the landlord, if you like, landlord class, and he's not ready, I think, to dismiss them as being sort of extraneous to what capital is about. They have to have a capitalistic role. You don't know what it is, but when he says that actually ground rent is something which is not explained by this circulation process, clearly that form of there's something going on in terms of that form of distribution which is, quote, outside of the totality as it's set up, in ways which is not true of the money market system. So that, for instance, in volume 3 of Capital, he will say of the credit system that it's a bit like where the common capital of the class is managed through the credit system. Because if you're going to equalize the rate of profit, what is the agency that's going to equalize the rate of profit? Well, it's likely to be through the credit system, which will lend money to places where the profit rate is high and take away resources from places where it's low. And so, in a sense, it becomes the manager of the capitalist class interest as a whole. And so Marx starts to talk about that. So you can explain where interest comes from and why it's so important, because of the necessity of the equalization of the rate of profit, which means high mobility of capital, and there's some agency which is going to redistribute from one field to another. And so he can rationalize interest, he can rationalize merchant capital, and he can rationalize obviously industrial capital, and I suppose rationalize taxes too, but he can't really rationalize very clearly why it is that we still have something going in terms of land rent. Clearly in this passage he's kind of saying, okay, I've got to find out what the rationale is for the contemporary form of landed property, and in exactly the same way that he says, money has a different function under capital and therefore is not the same as the money which existed so the same is true of the merchant, and same is true. He's going to try and say the same, and to some degree you can see some means. In my own work, I would say, well, land rent plays a very important role, particularly when you recognize the differences in fertility which exist on the land. But even more important would be rationalizing land uses and locational structures in such a way as to facilitate the spatial reorganization of capitalism along efficient and optimal lines. I mean, I would kind of say in that instance you would see the role of land rent would come in that way, but that would be my particular explanation. But it is still the case that many people working in the Marx field will take up the theory of ground rent and say this is problematic, and there's considerable discussion as to what might happen. But Marx is saying here, I obviously need to think about that, so there's going to be a book on ground rent. And in fact, of course, there are these long chapters on ground rent and differential rent and so on, and absolute rent in the third volume of Capital. But I think it's the case, I would argue it's the case, well, most people now would argue the case, that the question of the rationale of land rent within a capitalist system is not clearly established on the left, and how to within the Marxist tradition. In fact, it's an area, as I think you know, of considerable discussion and argument. But it is interesting that in that particular scenario of what he's going to look at, you see something like, the elements of this system are there. Okay, I've got to deal with distribution and distribution arrangements. Any other kind of comments? Yeah.
When you were explaining the passage about the labor, I was wondering about how Marx would think about the question of, the current question of 4.0 and 5.0 society, robotics and labor, as we are now facing. So I was thinking maybe the quantitative qualities of the labors will now get visible. I don't know, maybe you can just reflect on that question a little bit. Maybe it's outside of that seminar.
Yeah, I don't know how Marx would deal with that question. I mean, the question of technology and loss of labor and so on is handled a bit later on, and we do get into some interesting discussions as to what happens to the value theory under conditions of, in effect, zero labor input into the production system. So there are discussions of that which come up. There is a discussion of that comes up later, but it's a very specific form. I have a feeling about this, that if it is the case, this is a hypothesis if you like, if it is the case, and this is where the value theory comes in, that value is no longer being produced in certain areas of the economy because of the robotics and all the rest of it. That if that is the case, and if there is a monetary system which at some point is required, as Marx felt it always should be required, to have a basis in value production, then the problem for capitalist society then would become, where is the value going to come from, which is going to support the monetary value, which is supposedly an expression of value, in such a way that the system is still expanding and can continue to expand. And I think it is interesting that for every innovation and so on that gets set up, which displaces labor and seems to have the impact of reducing value output, we see the rise of certain other forms of labor employment which are value producing and value creating, which are low tech, as it were, and minimal. So that if it is the case that the only way in which there can be any kind of stability in a capitalist society is one in which the value relations are, being worked in such a way as to create the possibility for the monetary expansions which are occurring, then where are those expansions going on? The sort of thing I would look to here is to kind of say, all right, there's been a massive increase in the total value of output of goods and services since the 1970s. It's gone from about $30 trillion to close to $80 trillion. It's a huge increase in the monetary aspect. And then you kind of say, well, what parallels that in the value-producing sphere? And the answer is I don't really quite know, but one data point I would use is that the total wage labor force which exists within the world has increased by 1 billion since around 1970, 1980. That the total global wage labor force in 1980 was around 2 billion and it's now at around 3 billion. Now, what are all those 3 billion people doing? I don't I don't know, and if you ask the question, a lot of it seems to be in the realm of unproductive labor, which is where this question that is posed here, what's the difference between productive labor and unproductive labor, that becomes significant, and Marx just mentions it here and kind of says to be dealt with later. But we need to know that, I think, because if that 1 billion extra labor force is engaged purely in unproductive labor, then the whole global economy is plainly out of whack. If, on the other hand, that 1 billion explains how it can be that there was this huge expansion in global GDP because there's another billion laborers, most of whom are producing productive, most of whom are involved in productive labor. Now, my guess is that a large chunk of the extra billion are engaged in unproductive labor, but a goodly proportion of it has been engaged in the increase in productive labor, even though in certain sectors like automobile and steel and all the rest of it, plainly there's been an incredible reduction in the number of productive workers because of technological dynamism, technological change. So these are the kinds of questions, I think, which are there. What Marx would have made of it, I really have no idea. I mean, there it is, somewhere or other. Oh, that would be volume 3, or volume 5, or volume 20, to be developed elsewhere, to be developed later, those kinds of things. But I think it's a very interesting and I think rather critical question right now. I don't share the view that technological change has so eroded and erased productive labor that there is very little productive labor left to support the whole system. I think there's a lot of productive labor around. We're just seeing it in different forms. I mean, I would, for instance, Marx argues that people involved in transport and communications are productive workers. You look at the whole logistics sector and you look at, I don't know, UPS and all the delivery people around, and as far as Marx is concerned, these are productive workers. And you see the expansion of the logistics sector, even to the point of, but they're in areas which are not traditionally thought of as being proletarian in the sense of factory work. For instance, if all of the delivery workers delivering takeout food are productive laborers, there's been an enormous increase in delivery work. Because in many parts of the world, people are living on takeout food a lot of the time, including me now. So so when you kind of look at that, you would say actually there's a lot of productive labor here, and that productive labor is producing surplus value for someone down the line, and that therefore. The fact that automobile production has now been so automated that you don't need that many workers is not.
I think the robots, the whole robotics, it's starting now. So
yes.
we will now see
Yes.
how much?
Right.
Yeah, it's
Yeah. Any other kind of comments or questions?
Hi. Sticking with this distinction of productive and unproductive labor, it seems what we were getting at the end of the comment had to do with how one of the capitalism to go on is to always be expanding towards some direction and always colonizing new forms of labor to generate more value. And it seems that we were indicating that one of the ways in which it is expanding now is towards the transforming not unproductive labor into productive labor, right? Things that used to be considered unproductive now becomes productive. But what I was wondering is that when Marx is working that distinction, is he making that distinction a necessary distinction for the working of capitalism? In other words, capitalism requires a distinction, requires unproductive labor to function, or no, in any other case, we can assume this is a new frontier for capitalism to expand until there's not any more unproductive labor. Now labor is supposed to become productive.
I think the transformation of labor into productive labor, which produces surplus value, depends very much on the form of the labor process and the social relations expressed in the labor process. That is, if you take something like food preparation or something of that kind, I mean, all the time it was done in the household, it was unproductive labor. Not because it was not useful, but because it was not producing surplus value. On the other hand, if you have, I don't know, something like Grubhub or something like that sets up, it takes what was unproductive activity and turns it into productive activity because it becomes a vehicle for the creation of surplus value and the extraction of surplus value for big capital. And big capital will colonize this area in that kind of way. So again, Marx's argument here is the capital is defined by the process and by the social relations, not by the actual description of the actual food preparation. I mean, the food preparation is a food preparation, but if the circumstances are embedded in different social relations and different processes, then you can move in that direction. Now, why it is that capital somehow or other can start to take on certain areas which are not considered initially to be capital making. I mean, Marx makes this kind of, he actually in his writings kind of talks about the question of the schoolmaster. Is the schoolmaster a productive laborer? The answer is, well, if the school starts to become a capitalist enterprise, and we've seen, for instance, the commodification of education in such a way that, in fact, it has become now a vehicle for the production of surplus value. And as soon as it becomes a vehicle for the production of surplus value, it joins the productive, when in fact you could do exactly the same thing without it being part of the surplus value production apparatus. But one of the things that neoliberalism has been about, of course, is expanding more and more. I mean, Marx's kind of comment here, by the way, about, well, if you got a completely developed capitalist system and you go and form a colony, well, there's your expansion there as the colonial enterprises, which you can take, and you can take an arena of the world which is not producing surplus value and turn it into a surplus value producing area. Well, you can start to do the same thing about sectors. That sectors which were not surplus value producing suddenly become surplus value producing. So yeah, I mean, that's what I think one of the things that is I find this is sort of an interesting kind of question. If it is necessary for capital to produce value and surplus value, in the way Marx says here, if this is what really fixes what a capitalist society must be about, that it must expand itself, it must be self-replicating in this way. If that is the case, then where is the value going to come from? And how is it going to be continued in a situation where at the same time, the technological change, which is also necessary for this system, is playing a particular role of reducing the labor input. So, and Marx talks about this, by the way, very explicitly, and it comes up in here too, where capital does these two things. One is it reduces the labor input because it's constantly about labor-saving innovations, which takes labor out and therefore reduces value. At the same time, as the mass being produced is expanding, so you're expanding the value creation. So you've got this dual thing. You've got labor-saving innovations, and then you've got an expanding mass, which is why I sort of mentioned the fact that the number of wage-bought laborers in the world has increased by 1 billion since around 1980. Because that then tells you something about the mass, and even if only half of them are involved in value-producing activities, that's a hell of a lot. And so this is the kind of thing that intrigues me right now about the totality of the structure, and why it's important to think through the totality of the structure and what it might look like, and some of the things going on. I mean, this is why I find this Marxist formulation sometimes so interesting to think about in terms of where they go, even though he doesn't handle this productive and unproductive at all, except he does say something that is very important there. I mean, he's very blunt about it. He kind of says, you know, when it comes to kind of services for the capitalist not interested in that. Doesn't give a hoot about it. That's, you know, it's irrelevant. And it's then this kind of question of how to handle these aspects of labor which are unproductive, and it becomes a bit. I find the debate about productive and unproductive labor gets to a point where it's rather tiresome. Is that piece of labor unproductive or is it not? And it becomes difficult to tell, particularly when Marx starts talking, as he does in Capital, about the collective laborer. So that the collective laborer, he says, well, you don't have to think of a laborer as a person that actually makes something, because there are many laborers around that laborer who are actually creating the conditions under which something can be made, and they should be considered part of the collective laborer. But then you say, well, but actually contemporary industry is typically organized by subcontracting. For example, cleaning or machine maintenance or something of that kind. It's all subcontracted. So they're no longer part of the collective laborer. Well, are they then? So what was once productive because it was internalized within the factory now becomes unproductive because it's turned into, except to the degree that the subcontracting is to a firm which is also gaining surplus value through the employment structures, it becomes surplus value producing in another kind of way. So again, there are all these sorts of complications that arise when you get into it. But I think one of the big problems that I mentioned in this formulation here is that Marx does not have a very clear, I think, understanding of the value theory and the role the value theory should be making. And his tendency to say, well, yeah, no, we've got to deal with value and value theory, but then it's exchange value, and it's not. And so there are some problems with the formulation here. Okay, so let's leave it there. So next time we are going to read what page? 304 to 370. Okay, 304 to 370. Yeah, so not quite so long this time. More intense. So 304 to 370. And I do want to remind you, if you haven't signed in, if you're doing this for credit, you have to sign in If you don't sign in, you're likely to find yourself with a 20-page paper due at the end of the class. Nice threat. Okay? Good.